back, everyone. You're watching We Heart Therapy, the special series EFT Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Annabelle Bugatti, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified EFT supervisor and therapist here in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. And I am super excited to be bringing back with us today Dr. Leanne Campbell. She's done quite a few episodes with us before, and she is fantabulous. She is a registered psychologist in Canada. She's an ICEEFT certified EFT trainer. She's actually one of the originals with ICEEFT and EFT. She's been working with Sue since nearly the beginning, and she's amazing. And she's a founder of the Vancouver Island Center for EFT in Canada. And she is one of our trauma specialists, and she's an EFT specialist, and she's just absolutely incredible. And we are so honored and blessed to have you back today. So thank you, Leanne, for just joining us back today. And we're going to be talking about grief today.
Yes.
And, I always say there's really not much that EFT can't handle, and this is just another example. And so thank you for gracing us today and honoring us with your wisdom around grief.
Thank you, Annabelle, for that beautiful introduction, and great to be with you again and your amazing community. Thank you. And thank you for all you bring to EFT.
Thank you so much. And likewise. And if you want to just kind of get us started, if you want to maybe give everyone maybe a brief description of grief when we're talking about grief and how we might view that through the attachment lens.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Well, I think just a really basic definition of grief is that grief is a response to loss. And attachment theory knows a lot about love and loss. And we've been spending a lot of years focused on couples and how to build bonds and strengthen bonds, and maybe a little bit less attention on how we help our clients manage when those bonds are lost due to divorce or death or separation or whatever the case may be. So I'm really happy to be here talking a bit more about grief and loss. And and when we think about making sense of grief through the lens of attachment, I think there's, we could spend all day, but a few key points is that one, as many of you have heard Sue say, and probably you say, Annabelle, and many other trainers and all kinds of people say that we are wired for connection. Bonding is a biological imperative. We need each other like fish need water, as Sue often says. And so it makes perfect sense that when we lose someone very special to us, a pillar of security, as Mario McAllister and Bill Shaver describe in some of their writings, that there would be this period of longing. And that makes perfect sense, that we would be searching for our loved one. As Joan Didion beautifully described in her book around the loss of her husband, it feels so disorienting and destabilizing. It's as though she's waiting for her husband to show up at the door looking for his shoes. And those of us who have worked a lot in grief and loss know that that's a common experience.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. And when I think of therapists discussing grief, what I find is it's like almost what I think I hear is kind of a loss of a roadmap for many therapists is like, okay, well, at least in EFT, we're used to bringing people together and you have two people in the room and we're helping to increase the connection of a bond. But what happens when that bond goes away, when, you may only be working with one person in the room, then it's kind of like, well, wait, what do we do now? And first and foremost, what comes to my own heart is one of the other fundamentals of EFT is just being able to sit with people in their distress and tolerate it. And I think this is important when it comes to grief, because our instinct as humans, when we see someone suffering, is to try to fix it and make it better. But in EFT, we also know that being with somebody in their pain is a way of making it better, even though it's not like magic beans or something, or like a wand, like I dub thee no longer sad, And as sadness, I think for them to experience that sadness is an important part of the healing journey. And It feels like a lot of therapists, even outside EFT, sort of get eager to rush the process. So do our clients, is like, let's hurry up and feel better. And, that sadness, that loss really honors the connection, honors that something really mattered, someone really mattered to someone. And I don't want to deprive them of that. I think that grief is like a form of respect also for what was had, So let's talk about how that kind of sits with you around this idea of a roadmap and being able to sit and tolerate people in distress, like just to hold that with them. I think that's really tough.
Yeah, beautifully said, Annabelle. I really appreciate what you're saying about, and I think in EFT, we, of course, emotion-focused therapy, are accustomed to working with emotion, but oftentimes the intensity of emotion associated with grief can be really challenging. And especially because for many of us, of course, it might put us in touch with our own sense of loss around someone we loved or have loved and love, or it might overwhelm us. And especially when that loss is sudden and traumatic, the intensity of emotion can be overwhelming. But that's exactly so. That's what we know from an attachment perspective and from an EFT perspective, is that when we can walk alongside someone in their most vulnerable moments, in their moments of need, that is healing. And so oftentimes in grief, the way that I think about it is that sometimes simply people need a companion to walk alongside them, to be able to tolerate the intensity of that emotion, to not rush it, to not provide some kind of prescription or timeline that suggests that people have to move on. From an EFT perspective, absolutely. We would expect that people need to move through grief, not on from grief. And that in so doing, we actually can hold our loved ones indefinitely. We know that in the attachment literature, people talk about a symbolic source of security. And again, we can turn to researchers and clinicians and theoreticians such as McLunser and Shaver and others, and lots of great books out there. And in the grief literature, we often hear that same term or that same idea being coined as a continuing bond. And, working in trauma, as you noted that I do, that we can use that continuing bond as a resource for clients as well, just like we do. We know that when we have a felt sense of security with those who matter most, we can call upon them from near and far, whether they're at work or at the grocery store, or even those that we have lost. So an example that comes to mind for me is working with a beautiful young Indigenous woman. And, one of the things that we do in EFT is we tune into the pivotal experiences that have shaped models of self and other, for better and for worse. And so one of the things that we think about in stage 1 of therapy is resourcing our client. And early on with this beautiful young woman, I joined her in her grandmother's garden and got to know her grandma, and walked with her through the filled clothesline, and tuned in to the image of her grandma, the kerchief she wore, her eyes, the way she looked at this little girl, the traditional basket that sat high on a shelf, and the little children, many grandchildren who would come and stay with her, would boost each other up to reach the candy. And you notice as I share in these details, it becomes alive and we can all feel it. And then when we do that with our clients, they too can tune into these resources, these continuing bonds, in ways that they might not have recognized. And in fact, many weeks later, in working with this client, she shared with me that she hadn't thought about her grandma in that way. Even though her grandma was near and dear to her and such a special person, she hadn't realized this potential to call upon her in really explicit ways.
That's really beautiful. And I really feel that. And sort of the way my brain processes things is in images. So as you're describing the image, I'm sort of playing the Hollywood film in my brain, the Hallmark movie, right? And I feel like what a cool experience of getting to know somebody who's not even physically present, but and what a wonderful way to honor their memory. And I mean, that's sacred and that's pretty awesome. And I love what you're saying also about attachment. And what we know about attachment is that we have that working model of self and others, and we can access that model of others, our secure attachment figures, almost like a file that we can visit and draw from in moments of distress. And that emotional connection can span physical proximity, physical closeness, which is super helpful when there's grief. And I know some of the really powerful enactments that I've done in EFT with my clients when they have been grieving a loved one who's passed away is, very similar. We get to know that person and, we invite that loved one who's passed on into the room. I have them imagine their voice. Can you hear their voice? What would they be saying to you? How do you feel as you hear their voice right here, right now? And it just really is a game changer for them, and what a beautiful experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just returning to this notion of loss and identity. Of course, in EFT also, we talk about our sense of who we are being constructed and evolving in our most important relationships. So it makes perfect sense that our clients, that we would go through this period of disorientation and disorganization following the loss of a loved one. And so one of the things that we do in EFT was really tune in to what that relationship was like. Was it secure or insecure? What might be blocking the grief process if it is if it is blocked? And what do we mean by a block? Again, when we think about secure attachment being connected with this capacity to regulate emotion, to move with and through emotion, once again, we would expect in grief that we would walk alongside clients in these waves of emotion that people talk about. And Michelunster and Shaver talk about this oscillation between allowing for the longing and the yearning and the intensity of grief, and then avoiding it as well, which people often will describe as feeling some sense of guilt. So we'll tune into that, and then we'll look for places where people might be blocked. And if they are, we help to remove those blocks or those barriers to grief so that they can continue to grow and evolve, even in the context of this, what can be a devastating loss.
Yeah. So a couple things come up for me right here that I can just imagine that folks, if they were going to raise their hand and ask during this, here's some of the things. And it's often one of the things that I hear on Facebook where therapists might say, well, how do you know that they've grieved enough, or that, they're stuck in grief and that they need to move on? And again, I think part of it can be the therapist's own anxiety, like low, not a great window of tolerance or a huge window of tolerance for just tolerating distress. And, maybe some fundamentals we could outline too about somebody's ability to move through the grieving process. And then I'd like to get more clear about blocks, if that's okay with you. I think it depends on how the relationship ended, how long the relationship was, like the strength and quality of the bond. How long ago was the loss? Was it a traumatic loss? Was it something that they anticipated was coming? I mean, certainly somebody who's been married for 30 years isn't going to just magically get over it in 6 weeks, and probably not even like 6 months, but some therapists may get anxious just kind of sitting there in session week after week, like, okay, we're just processing the loss. What do we do? Like, they're not getting better, but what is better here?
Yeah.
What is the thing that we're really going for? And you said something that kind of really struck me as the thing that we are going for is, and I think it is part of the grief stages is that sense of acceptance and peace. And that brings up sort of where some of the blocks can be is if there's like an anxious or an avoidant attachment, it could be we're eager to hold on to them and like kind of fear letting go as if accepting it means they're gone forever and we don't, they're not quite sure how to hold on to that bond, even as they have acceptance for the loss of the relationship or the loss of the loved one. Could also be like similarly with avoidance, right? And there's a lot of emotion on the inside that never gets dealt with. And I find this often with clients, not even around the loss of like a person who's passed away, but, lost relationships, maybe lost bonds with, family members that just aren't interested in participating in health and relationship. And so having to grieve like the idea of certain types of bonds and being able to sit in that place. I was actually doing some grief work with the client yesterday and just kind of, we know that process of emotion, EFT, sitting with them in their emotion. And then I noticed the tendency of the client to want to pivot out of that space. And I sort of brought them back and I said, has anyone ever sat with you in your pain and just been with you and comforted you and legitimized the pain that you're going through? And my client was like, no. And then a new grief process started to happen.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, beautiful. That's a beautiful. Yeah, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Yeah, and then I think about isolation is inherently traumatizing, even more so when we are in pain and overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion associated with grief. So one of the things that we often talk about, returning to your great question and comments about what does grief look like? What does successful grieving look like? Well, of course, grief is as unique as the relationships we have with those we love and lose. So there's not really any kind of specific formula associated with that. But one of the things that I think about often is that there's not really any expiry date on love. And similarly, there's no expiry date on grief. Grief can last a lifetime. And those of us who have loved and lost know that we can anticipate grief to visit us at various times in our lives. For example, the anniversary of the loss or the person's birthday or a season, whatever the case may be. But we can also expect it to show up at times that we don't expect it, that we can be triggered by loss and feel that same gut-wrenching nausea in our stomach or whatever the case may be. And what attachment theory and science would tell us is to face it and embrace it and welcome it. And I love the way that you described it, that in some ways we can think about these difficult emotions, these waves of grief as being representative of the love and respect we have for those we've lost.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And you said something right here too that really touched me, that feels really important. And I think maybe sometimes we forget that grief isn't necessarily a problem to be solved.
No, exactly.
Like it's okay for people to be sad when the anniversary of, if it was like the great love of their life who passed on, or a parental figure, and the anniversary of their passing, that grief comes to visit. I mean, I would worry if they didn't feel sad.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a process to be honored, an organic process to be honored. And when we do so, we continue to grow and evolve in our most important relationships, including that with the deceased.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess then it comes back to this idea of healthy grief. How do we know when a person is stuck? And again, I think it kind of might go back to the how it affects our functioning, right? Like immediately after a loss. It's normal that there might be a period that, there might be some debilitating grief, but if that debilitation stays in place for long, long, long periods of time versus somebody who is able to grieve, someone who's able to honor that, who's able to be with the emotion and have both that emotion, but also function in their day-to-day life. So what would you kind of say versus not successful grieving versus not successful grieving?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I would want to say that this idea of success maybe is in the eyes of the individual who's experiencing the loss. And what comes to mind for me is that, I think that's right, that sometimes people will come to us and they feel paralyzed by the loss. And really, grief is mobilizing. So that's one of the things that we can tune into, is whether our clients are moving with and through the emotion associated with this loss. And when people are paralyzed for a period, again, that's not uncommon, that when we lose a pillar of security, somebody that we really counted on near and far, that we can expect to be shut down, to not want to eat, to not want to sleep, to not be doing well, to having difficulty concentrating, and all of those things. And what comes to mind for me is a woman that I worked with recently who beautifully shared with me her story of love and loss. And I wrote about it actually in the Psychotherapy Networker and worked with beautiful Livia and Lauren. And it's published, I think, in a summer issue. But in any case, she talked about her family wanting her to have, quote, moved on. And she felt she didn't know whether she should have moved on and whether these expectations were in fact warranted or whether she was on track. And so as an EFTer, as you know, as the audience knows, we join our clients from a place of curiosity, not assumption. So I loved what you were saying earlier about tuning in to maybe the way that she moves with and through her emotion. Most typically, does she tend to avoid, or does she reactively intensify emotion, or some combination of both? Or does she typically move with and through emotion? But right now, this is hard because this is an overwhelming set of circumstances. So I joined her in her marriage, actually, and got to know her partner. And she shared about their history together, how they met, and their love story. She talked about building a cabin in the woods and taking their small children there. And as notice how when we tune into, once again, just like we did with the beautiful Indigenous client that I was describing earlier, when I tune into her world and join her in her marriage, in her home, in her family, I can get a sense of the security of that attachment, and I can get a sense of the love that they shared. And then she talked about them retiring and moving, and all their dreams in hand to travel and all of that. And then he started to get more and more unwell, and nobody knew what was going on, and they were in and out of hospital. And then she talked about, we got our diagnosis between curtains in crowded emergency wards, which is common, I think, probably North America, but most certainly in Canada. And then he made the gut-wrenching decision to choose MAID, which is medical assistance in dying, which is relatively new in Canada. And she talked about honoring him and wanting to support him, and their kids did too. And then when we entered the hospital room and tuned into those final moments together, it's there that she said, I was in survival mode. I was in survival mode. all of her resources were going to him and supporting him and to being there for her family. And she shut down. In that moment, she shut down. So then that's a cue to us that this is a potential block. So we revisited that room in EFT, as we do, and as you were alluding to earlier. And as we did so, she began to get in touch with her own needs and longings. And initially, she would say, it's okay to go, which is what she said in the moment, to support him. But as she tuned into her experience and became absorbed in it, she called out and said, I don't want you to go. Of course, that's what she said. So in that moment, she was able to tune into her own experience. She was able to share that with him. And as she did so, the grasp of his strong, crispy hand was felt, that the strength of his arms around her, and all of that became more vivid and more alive as she tuned into her own felt experience. And then on the other side of that, she started to talk about being able to see the apple tree that they had planted in memory of him, being able to visit him, being able to share with him stories of a grandbaby being born, of a new puppy. And then, one of the things that really, really moved me and moves me as I talk about it is she talked about honoring him with a beautiful, beautiful cedar box with an eagle atop it. And then she talked to her kids, their children, about having a second box, and that the eagles would face one another when she joined him. And kind of the end of the story, and that really sits with me so poignantly, is she said, eagles mate for life.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful image of a continuing bond.
Oh, that's so touching. Even here now, I feel like if I was in the session with her, I would be weeping.
Yes.
Like I want to weep right now just listening to such a beautiful image and just such a beautiful story and such a beautiful bond of love.
Yeah.
And I think this really speaks to the very heart of what we do in session is really unpacking the bond and helping them explore and feel and connect to that loved one. And it can just be so healing, right? And I imagine, again, I kind of bring back to therapists who maybe don't have as strong of a roadmap as we do in EFT, or unsure of how to read the map, how we when somebody passes away or we lose a relationship or a loved one, it leaves a hole, right? But the idea isn't necessarily to plug the hole with something different, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well said. That's right. And especially, I think, in the early days of loss, most poignantly, we feel a void. We, again, expect our partner to look for their shoes at the door, or we expect our pet to be outside the door when we come through it. And from an attachment point of view, what we would say is that, returning to your good question about grief, is that when we grieve someone we love, we make space for something or someone new while retaining the old, while maintaining in the case that I was talking about earlier, her story of love and loss. And as we do that, we continue to grow and expand, and there's more space for new things.
That really strikes me as very important when we're thinking about how grief affects someone, and sort of successful, non-successful grief, or, the sense of stuckness is, if we lose, not to say that moving on always means having new relationship. I guess it sort of depends on where you are in your life and such. But if you're even a younger person who's grieving a living person, loss of a relationship, how is that loss experienced? I think one of the fundamentals of loss that we have to do is organize it, be with them in that place and organize, make meaning, make sense out of it, which not a lot of people get. And again, it goes back to the idea of trauma. What happens, not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us, which certainly loss, it can be traumatizing. And so to be in it and make sense out of it, organize it, is the person then kind of responding in an avoidant kind of way where this hurts so much that I never want to feel this again, that I never want to open my heart again. And so really working through those spaces, right? Or not really, maybe in an anxious way, not letting themselves really sit and honor the feelings, but trying to plug the hole by quickly, like too quickly, moving on as a way to numb out the pain.
Yes. Yeah. Annabelle, as you shared that, one of the things that came to mind is, yeah, that's right. I just shared a beautiful story of love and loss and secure attachment. But that's right. Sometimes we lose loved ones and we haven't resolved an attachment injury, or we haven't grieved the loss of our childhoods that came before the loss of a caregiver or a parent or an aunt or an uncle or whatever the case may be, or we haven't resolved some aspect of that relationship. So there can be layers of loss. And again, the attuned EFT or EFT therapist will join with the client to really get to know the world that they live in and have lived in, and the context of their relational world, including the relationships with lost loved ones. And so too, do we then begin to identify potential blocks or barriers to growth and to connection. And we can then, like you say, use our roadmap to help remove those barriers and kickstart this organic growth process that we wholly believe in and have the honor of witnessing day after day in our therapy world.
That's so well said. Is, you shared a beautiful story of the loss of secure attachment. What happens when there's not a securely attached relationship and you have to grieve that, which can almost be more disorienting, right? Harder to make sense out of it because there were feelings that were unresolved before the loss, and then more feelings that come through the loss. And, there's so many complexities there and layers. And, I was just thinking, are there any kinds of blocks that you see? I mean, I know they can be very diverse and nuanced, but are there any common ones that kind of come to your mind that you see more frequently than others? Or what are some basic starting blocks that therapists might expect to encounter?
Yeah, good question. So when we think about, emotion-focused therapy, and emotion moves us. So central from an EFT point of view is that a block is likely to emerge in the context of a pivotal event that shapes us, but we've not moved with and through the emotion associated with that event. It could be a loss, it could be an attachment injury, it could be a traumatic event. And so returning to these key pivotal moments and really tuning in and being curious about how our clients have managed those helps us to discern where and when our client might have become blocked in terms of, once again, this organic growth process.
Could a block be sort of like around the acceptance that the loss occurred, the finality of it?
Yes, and most certainly. in my work surrounding traumatic loss, that is common. And I would consider that a part of this whole notion of disorganization and disorientation, that denial, quote unquote, could be a part of it. And not wanting to believe. Of course, I don't want to believe that the young boy that I said goodbye to is not coming home again and had his whole life ahead of him. Of course, I don't want to believe that. Or a missing person. Of course, I don't want to believe that that person is ever going to be found again, and be a part of our dinner table or a part of our annual events or celebrations such as weddings or whatever the case may be, of course. And again, attachment provides us with a guide and a map that all of this makes exquisite sense. So we can track and validate and be with our clients wherever they are and help them move forward from wherever their starting point is.
Yeah. And the word comfort comes to mind, help them receive comfort. And it's amazing how many clients struggle to receive comfort in places of pain. Yeah.
And I think that makes perfect sense. Nobody encounters vulnerability alone. We hear that and talk about that a lot. And so sometimes not encountering vulnerability alone is not just about being alone, but being able to take in the love from another, or the comfort or the care from another. And so that is potentially a block that might get in the way of helping a client.
Especially if they've had to face vulnerability, unfortunately, alone previously in their life, that facing it not alone can be new and disorienting.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you were talking about something too, and I thought about, I think about the idea of divorce and breakups and separation, and some of the grief work I do there, where I find some clients with anxious attachment rush to move on super fast, and then they're still angry and they spend their early dating periods talking constantly about their ex, even if it's in a negative way, like bashing them, expressing anger, and thinking, well, maybe we're not totally through grieving this relationship. And so there's so many, it just reminds me of all the various facets of love and loss. But I think it's complex on both sides. Some say, death is harder if there's something unresolved, this feeling of how do I resolve that? Though others would, have described maybe death would feel better because our tendency of humans to want to pin it on something. We can say, well, because there was a death, but what if that person's living? And the idea of them still living means I was rejected versus they left, unintentionally, or without the choice.
Yeah.
And coming back around those meanings associated with loss.
Yeah. And working in trauma, we see that a lot, and that people will often blame themselves for the lack of love or connection or caring and caregiving. And again, we have a map to help clients to tune into themselves and find themselves in new ways that allow them to identify a bit more self-compassion, and then begin to dissolve some of that shame that so often accompanies that kind of loss or that kind of abandonment.
Yeah. So we can sort of talk about another form of grief here that I imagine therapists might be asking about, that doesn't necessarily include another person, but maybe parts of self, like, loss of identity. Maybe a person is going through a growth cycle and internally, and they're becoming someone new, letting go of childhood, moving out of the youthful part of adulthood into midlife or retirement. How would the work shift or be maybe a little more nuanced when we're talking about grief in these ways?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think that's right. Loss can come in very varying forms: loss of country, loss of identity, loss of job and vocation, which is associated with identity, retirement, all kinds of things can bring us face to face with loss and grief. And I think the same principle holds, that when we really can join with our clients and move with and through the emotion associated with that, that allows our clients to grieve and make space for something or someone new. And it's there that they can then begin to be curious and explore and identify new possibilities, for example, in terms of relationship, or in terms of creating a home in a new country, and embracing the old, perhaps bringing more to the forefront. As we grieve, it's easier for us to tolerate cues and memories that put us in touch with our loss, so we can bring forward more of who we are in those capacities when we've allowed ourselves to feel some of the emotions associated with the loss of those aspects of our histories.
What really comes to my mind again is, we mentioned this early, is meaning making. And we know that human beings in general are meaning making machines. And I think when we move through a loss, whether it's a person or a relationship or a part of self, an identity, if we're not I think part of the grief process that's essential is the ability to make meaning, to come alongside them and order and organize the meaning, because it's a lot easier to also make sense of the emotions attached when we can connect them to the emotion. And, as Rumi says, the cure for the pain is in the pain, right? So being able to come into that pain, not to camp out and set up permanent residence, but to make meaning, to get the cure, to really be able to order and organize and know where we need to do our work, where the most healing needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, we are just not wired to do that alone.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Even as I think back with a lot of clients who have gone through things now, and we reflect over their childhood where they didn't have the one thing that they lacked was a caregiver coming alongside them in pain and organizing their experience. So then, of course, through their adult life, as they go through other painful experiences and loss, they have a hard time organizing and make sense of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so as therapists, we need to tune in a way that allows our clients to move through those layers of loss potentially.
So if there's a therapist who, I wouldn't imagine, maybe based on a therapist's own window of tolerance, but I wouldn't imagine that folks necessarily have to be a grief specialist. If you work with humans and you work with emotions and you're highly skilled at working with both, that you can still work with grief. But if folks feel kind of new to the idea of grief, or maybe through this we're helping them see that they can work with grief, what message would you give to them about where to start, or if they had one nugget to take away today about working with grief, what would you say?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I think that, grief is a part of our shared humanity, and that, I think it's valid and legitimate that for some therapists, and especially in the early days or the wake of their own grief and loss, that might be intolerable to sit with others in theirs. And I think would be, of course, legitimate. And I think that in EFT, of course, we're very accustomed to working with emotion and intense emotion. But for some of us, that's hard. It's hard to maintain our emotional balance. It's hard to not be impacted by what can be really gut-wrenching loss. But I think I think once again, people will have their own roadmaps, and the roadmap we have, of course, is an attachment-based humanistic experiential therapy that allows us to walk with our clients with and through the grief and loss. And we are fortunate to be able to do that. And the thing that comes to mind is I work a lot also with first responders who might have to share with a loved one that their child or their partner or whoever it might be may not be coming through this door again, and they remain at the doorstep. As therapists, we have the amazing privilege to walk through that door and with our clients to the other side of the loss that can be so devastating and often shocking in a moment like that. So I think I would say that it's a great honor and privilege, and I would encourage all of us to, I think, become more and more comfortable. And I think, there's a lot of discussion in community about feeling pressure around grief when we lose someone. And I think the more that we can even just share about that being a natural, organic process that we all go through, and that there's not a specific, prescription for how we do it and when we do it and the timeline for it. And most reassuring, I think, is this whole notion of continuing bonds, that even when we lose someone we love, someone precious, when that, and especially when that person has been a pillar of security, that we can hold on to the memories and the touch and the voice and all kinds of aspects of that person for a lifetime and beyond.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. And you said something here that really emerged in my mind about sort of a felt sense that maybe more modern industrialized countries struggle more with tolerating painful emotions, tolerating distress. And so, of course, when it comes to grief, maybe we see the problem as the fact that they had this loss rather than something, a natural part of life, and that we want to help them through. And it also strikes me as an opportunity to learn about somebody's culture. Because there are lots of cultures that have different expressions of grief. I mean, I think I met a lady from Vietnam who had expressed that they actually take a period of time. I think it's 8 days or something. I could be wrong, but when I remember, they take a period of time where it is to grieve as a family. The grave sites are like these big shrines. Everybody really comes together, this real felt sense of connection and honoring. And I think culturally, our relationship to death or loss is big. And a lot of cultures seem to make room for that as a healthy and normal process. And so, if you do have a client who's not from America, or even if they are, but they identify with another culture, this could be an opportunity to really bring in those parts. How would we honor this loss through the lens of your culture? How would we express grief, express love for this bond?
Yes. Well, such a very important and great point. Thank you. Yeah. So we've been talking about the care model in EFT, context, attachment, the therapeutic relationship or alliance, and emotion. And that's right. Again, we want to join with our clients from a place of curiosity. How do you make sense of grief? What does grief look like in your family? What does it mean to lose a loved one? What does loss mean? What happens? And what's your perception of what's, quote, normal or expected in your family, neighborhood, community, culture, whatever the case may be. And what does that look like and feel like? What did you do following the loss of a loved one? Was there any kind of certain ritual or service? And all those questions. And again, we want to join with our clients from a place of curiosity and really tune in to their specific felt experience, even if we know something about the world they lived in, to not assume, but to really listen and learn and tune in. And again, I think about that beautiful young Indigenous woman who shared with me about her relationship with her grandma, and just to really get not just information, but a visceral sense, really, I think helps us to tune in and be with our clients, join with our clients with this special safe haven alliance that we talk about in EFT.
That's so beautiful, Leanne. I even think, with some clients that maybe identify sort of a lack of rituals, a lack of tradition or expression, which I've had many clients say, and they actually felt kind of sad that there wasn't something like that. The family seemed kind of closed off or avoidant of processing that. And so, in some of my work with clients in that situation, we were able to be curious and, okay, so your family didn't have a ritual, but what would you like to do? Would you like to create a ritual? What speaks to you? What feels most honoring in your heart of this bond, of this relationship that you've had? And it's been really cool to have clients come up with their own ways that they want to honor that loss and be able to do something new.
Yes. Yeah. Such a great point. That's excellent. So earlier I was speaking about the woman who planted an apple tree, and initially it was hard for her to even look at that apple tree. And then on the other side of this process together, she could celebrate in the blossoms that came in spring and the apples that, of course, showed up in the fall months. And I love what you're saying about joining with our clients, and maybe their representation of their loved one might be a special rock or a necklace or whatever it might be. And then when they are in times of need, they could touch it and feel it and connect with that continuing bond or that key other.
And two, I want to make sure that therapists, what every time you talk about the apple tree, I think about my husband's loss of his grandfather. And this is where I want therapists to really check and make sure that we're mindful about bias. So we learn in multicultural counseling, it's very common for certain manifestations of loss to be normal, such as dreaming of a lost one, being visited by the spirit or the ghost. And so we don't want to jump to pathology, like maybe you're hallucinating, which I've definitely seen therapists do, and that can be a culture bias. And I think of, my husband has had, after his grandfather passed, he had a dream, sometime later, and his grandfather came to him, or he might have been talking to him on the phone, and he was talking about enjoying the avocados, something about the avocados. And so he told his grandmother, and she was just brought to life with that. And it really mattered to her. And it was like a message from him to her, because she knew this piece of him, that this was really him, because when he was younger, he would spend days picking avocados from the orchard, and it was his favorite thing to do. And he ate an avocado like every day of his life. So it was really special. And my husband's dog that passed away years ago comes and visits him in his dreams every now and then. And I know that it makes him very happy, so sometimes I've had clients where they're like, I don't dream about them. And that can feel like, what does that mean about our bond, that I'm not getting these visits that I long to have? So just really making space for multiple expressions of loss.
Yes. Yeah. I love the way you said that. Making space for multiple and varied expressions of loss. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome, Leanne. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope for the therapists watching that you feel inspired, that you feel maybe a sense of empowerment to step into grief with your clients, that, you don't have to have a magic wand or wear a cape in order to do this, that's really just coming alongside another human being and expanding our own window of tolerance to tolerate the distress that happens there, and just to be that comfort, that connection with them in this space. So, Leanne, if folks want to look you up, if they want to follow you or ask you to come to their area and do a training, where can they find you?
They can find me through EFT Vancouver Island. And if therapists are interested specifically in grief, I did do a grief training with Sue Johnson through PESI in the spring, and that's available. And yeah, lots of trainings in trauma and of course EFT and couple therapy. So yeah, a pleasure to be with you always, and yeah, and a part of this community.
And so your website is like VancouverislandEFT.com?
Yes.
Perfect. And I'll make sure that I put a link to Leanne's site in the description of this video, so you guys can just click right on it and find her. And of course, you can Google her. And can they email you through your website as well?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. And you mentioned some resources on PESI, so you can find Dr. Leanne Campbell on PESI as well and see her workshop on grief. And if you'd like to have her come to your area to do a training on grief or trauma or EFT, just reach out to Leanne. She's amazing. She's incredible. And I've been through quite a few of her trainings, and I just absolutely love it. I walk away with something powerful every time. So I really invite you guys to look her up and join. So thank you again, Leanne, for being with us. And it's just been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you to our viewers. Make sure that you check out my book on Amazon, Using Relentless Empathy in the Therapeutic Relationship, Connecting with Challenging and Difficult Clients. It is basically a whole self of the therapist book, going through various types of difficult clients and really challenging the therapist to look inside as to what comes up for them and work through some of their issues so they can be in that channel of empathy to be with the clients that they struggle with the most. And make sure that you guys visit ICEEFT.com for a list of EFT trainings coming up. And make sure you check out WeHeartTherapy.com. We got a lot of exciting things in the work, including retreats and conferences and therapist summer camp coming up in the summer of 2023. So make sure you check it out. And make sure that you click on Leanne's link if you're watching this on YouTube. If you are listening to this on podcast, you'll just have to rewind and take a note, unfortunately. But thank you again to all of our viewers. And just make sure that you hit subscribe, because more videos are on the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Don't forget to buy my book, Using Relentless Empathy in the Therapeutic Relationship, Connecting with Challenging and Resistant Clients, for helping professionals. Available on Amazon or on my website, www.drbugatti.com.